Hello, everyone. I'm Linda Elder. I am here coming to you from the Foundation for Critical Thinking, a 501c3 nonprofit organization in California. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar focused on how and why critical thinking is essential to flourishing democracies. So we are focusing on a very large set of topics, issues, concepts in this topic. And we know that people spend lifetimes studying democracies and what makes democracies work. And we know from our perspective, we're not experts, as in scholars of the concept of democracy. So we're asking, if we understand the tools of critical thinking, how will this help us open up the question of what is a democracy, what is a flourishing democracy, what is a successful democracy? And we can begin to explore questions that come out of that beginning place. So what I have done is I have asked the question, if we simply use the tools of critical thinking, to the degree that we have internalized those tools, what do these tools allow us to do with our thinking by employing the tools to understand a complex topic like how and why is critical thinking essential to flourishing democracies? Now I turn that into a question. So what I'm wanting you to see is that I've taken an exploratory approach to this, and I want to show you some of the intellectual or critical thinking moves that I have made in beginning to explore these interrelationships between critical thinking and democracy. When you begin to unravel this set of questions, one of the things that you see is that at every turn, when trying to understand democracies, successful democracies, ones that fail, at every turn, you are going to have to use critical thinking. There's no way around it. Therefore, in a brief talk, such as the one we're going to have today, all we can do is begin to open up these questions, begin to explore them. Again, remembering with an emphasis on how the explicit tools help us understand flourishing democracies and maintain them. So let me open then further with a set of questions and thoughts that lay the groundwork for everything else that we'll be doing in this presentation. So first, let us begin with this. Critical thinking is essential to successful democracies because educating the people is required for successful democracies, and because critical thinking is essential to education. So in other words, we all know that we've got to educate people truly if we're going to have successful democracies, because the people are determining what the democracy looks like to some degree or to a large degree. And therefore, we know the people must be educated. All of us have thought about the concept of democracy. We've read about it. We've pondered. We know that there's a relationship, a direct one between democracy and education. And then we ask, well, what is the relationship again between education and critical thinking? And the move that I made is that if you understand that you need education, then you also understand that you need critical thinking, because you can't have education without criticality or critical thinking. So again, these are opening thoughts as we begin to explore this topic. So another major point is that critical thinking is required even to figure out a reasonable conception of democracy and how it can be best advanced and maintained in a given context. So if you want to figure out a reasonable conception of democracy, and we're going to work with that presently, exploring that concept of democracy. To do that requires critical thinking. And then once you figure out the best democratic processes for a system, for a given context, then you're going to need critical thinking to detail and maintain all those processes. So do you see how again and again, you turn this way, you can't get away from critical thinking. You turn that way, there it is again. You turn this way and lo and behold, you need criticality there too. So here is a set of questions that will be driving part of our discussion then. What is the relationship between democracy and critical thinking? We know that's one of our questions, one of our core questions. And that leads to these core questions. What is democracy and what is critical thinking? Again, that's leading us back to the need to explore and develop a reasonable conception of democracy and to explore or to rely upon, if we already understand it, a rich conception of critical thinking. And we'll be, again, getting into that a bit presently. So critical thinking is required to critique existing systems of government, any system of government. And in this case, we're focusing on democracy. And it is required, again, to build and maintain any successful government through all of its systems. And we can start with human systems, human created systems, such as educational systems, social systems, cultural, familial, political, professional, business, government, all of the systems within a society must support a rich conception of democracy for it to flourish, for it to stand, for it to be successful, and for it to serve the people, which we know is an essential part of its core, even if we know nothing else about its core, that it must serve the people. So when we think of it this way, we realize that we can't blame one part of society for failures in democratic systems. We've got to look in all parts of human societies for the barriers to successful democracies. So we can't just put the weight on the schools to solve the problem, the weight on the parents to solve the problem. No, we've all got to solve the problem working through these systems. And again, this includes delineating best conceptions of democracies. Now, these are opening thoughts as we begin to unpack this topic again in these early questions. And now let me add to that some understanding of the concept, beginning to explore the concept of democracy a bit, and then we'll turn to some of the primary theory of critical thinking. So let me just give you some more, again, thoughts on the concept. So democracy, as in government of the people, by the people, and for the people, contrasts with other forms of government, such as oligarchy. So notice here, we're taking the concept of democracy and saying, what are some early moves we can make? So let's start with what are other primary forms or have been primary forms of governments that have existed or do exist. So democracy, of the people, by the people, for the people, contrasting with oligarchy, government of the few, by the few, and for the few. or plutocracy, government of the wealthy, by the wealthy, and for the wealthy. So we are beginning here to unpack the concept of democracy and how it compares to other forms. As such, democracy presupposes institutions and laws which prevent the few, and that includes the wealthy, from controlling the decision-making apparatus of the government. And we can ask, to what degree is this a problem in our culture, in our country, in any given society at any time in history? So if it becomes clear that big money plays a significant role in elections and decision-making in government, then should we conclude that the government is in fact not a full democracy, but let's say, or should we say democratic plutocracy or plutocratic democracy? And if you're saying, well, how do you know that, Linda, how do you know that big money is playing a significant role in our democracy? I would say that's a question that critical thinking, that the critical thinking process should help us answer. It's not a question that we should have a gestalt feeling about. It's a question that we should get the answers to by looking at the data itself. So these are some beginning thoughts, again, questions, and beginning to tap into the concepts. So again, some of this I've already mentioned, but let me just add, democracy also requires, again, that the people be educated, which means they have command of their mental capacities through critical reasoning. But are the people becoming educated so they can make reasonable decisions through the democratic process? What are the failures, again, in any of our systems, including the educational systems, to help people develop as critical-minded citizens who can and do make logical, ethical, political decisions? And again, how can critical thinking concepts and principles help humans advance and support thriving democracies? So now, let us turn to some of the theory of critical thinking to illuminate immediately how the tools of critical thinking are essential to the development and maintenance of successful democracies. And I want to start with this overview slide, which shows the core concepts in our framework for critical thinking. And I'm going to narrow in to the center to begin with, to the cultivation of intellectual traits. But what I want you to see here is that these concepts to us are at the very center of any defensible, reasonable conception of critical thinking, because they help us unpack and understand what is involved in reasoning itself and how we can begin to delineate tools for improving our own criticality. So we know that we're going to be ultimately and all along focused on cultivating intellectual traits. And again, I'm going to show some of the connectors to democracy presently with these traits or virtues. And we're going to focus in on some of these other tools, such as the analysis of thought and the assessment of thought. And we're also going to briefly focus on the barriers to critical thinking that impede our criticality generally and play a role in our inability as humans, inabilities to maintain functioning democracies, or let's say successful democracies. And I'm just realizing that I haven't been sharing my screen, so let me share that now, and you can see what I've been referring to. And this comes from our Thinker's Guide, the miniature guide to critical thinking concepts and tools. So this again simply details the core concepts in our approach. We're focusing on intellectual virtues. We're going to do that presently, the analysis of thought, the assessment of thought, and concern for the barriers. So you can see the guide that I'm working with in our community online, and I'm going to move over to that presently, but right now I'm working with the PDF file because it's a bit easier. So what I want to do now is to move to the intellectual virtues so that you can see some immediate connectors to, it's taking a while for it to move along. Let me see if I can make it go a little faster here. All right, so as critical thinkers, we are concerned to develop these intellectual virtues and others in our thinking. And these are interrelated, and these come to us through history, through the best thinking that humans have done historically. And what I want to point out here is that in our approach to critical thinking, as many of you know, we are hoping to embody these virtues. And we can ask, how do these virtues help us with the concept of democracy? And if you understand them, and if you understand their opposites, it's fairly easy to see these connections. So you can ask immediately questions like this. Let's take intellectual humility. Intellectual humility means that we can, at any given moment, when we're embodying these, distinguish what we know from what we do not know. We're clear as to what we know, and we don't step, and what we do not know, we do not step over that line. So in understanding reasonable democratic processes, we need to bring a considerable amount of intellectual humility to that process. Otherwise, we bring its opposite, and that's intellectual arrogance. And we walk in and say, look, I know what a good democracy is all about. It's about the three of us ruling everyone here. In other words, we will do what we want to do. Our thinking is perfect. There's nothing wrong with our thinking. And when we are doing this in group or en masse, we can see that it's even more problematic. We can take intellectual autonomy, the disposition to stand alone, even if it means you're the only one standing alone in the crowd, because you are using your best thinking, you're trying to employ at the highest degree criticality, and you are therefore willing and happy to stand alone rather than give up the beliefs that you believe are based in the highest levels of reasoning and context. So imagine the opposite of that. The opposite of that is intellectual conformity, the person who goes along with the crowd, goes along with the people who are saying things that don't make any sense. So imagine a country in which the people they're not embodying these virtues, and therefore they're, in this case, in terms of intellectual conformity, they're going along with the other people who are also not developing their critical thinking abilities, and they're doing this by the millions in certain cases, and they're feeling and thinking that there's nothing wrong with their thinking, because here we are in the millions. There's so many of us thinking this, we must be right. And they're all validating one another. And you should be able to see right away the connectors, some connectors to failures in democracies based on these problems. Intellectual empathy means we can enter other viewpoints and think within those viewpoints. not only can we do this, but we want to do this. We're motivated to do this. We're motivated to understand why other people think differently from us. And we hone in on the best reasoning, no matter from what angle it comes to us. And so the opposite is the person who cannot enter other viewpoints, cannot think within viewpoints that differ from his or her own. And do you see how this is a problem for democratic systems? If we can't talk to one another, if we can't listen to one another, if everything is yelling across the aisle and people behaving in immature ways, then we're going to have lots of problems in our political systems. And this will have ripple effects for the people themselves that the democracy is supposed to be serving. Fair-mindedness, what's the opposite? Selfishness. So how can we have functioning and successful democracies when we have people who are not fair-minded, but are routinely just looking out for what they can get for themselves? And again, when we raise this to the group level, we see many instances and examples of groups lacking fair-mindedness towards those outside the group. This also is a tremendous problem for the cultivation of democracies that work for the people. Confidence in reason means we follow the facts wherever they take us, whether we like it or not, whether we like where the facts are taking us or not. What is the opposite of confidence in reason? Well, there are multiple ways of saying this, but confidence in things other than reason, confidence in authority figures, confidence in blind faith. In critical thinking, we ask, are there any facts relevant to the situation? If there are, what are those facts? And we don't say we already know everything. I've got it covered, the intellectual arrogance side. We don't say I don't need to think within any other points of view. I've got it all figured out within my own point of view because my point of view is perfect. Again, lacking in intellectual empathy, going around the wheel again. So you see, these are just some examples in which I'm trying to show you that if you understand any of the theory of critical thinking, you should be able to immediately make connections between critical thinking theory and successful democracies, and how the opposite of intellectual virtues lead us away from successful democracies. Now, I will be taking questions at the end, so please hold your questions and chat them in for me if you can at that point. So now I want to move away from the virtues, having just begun to explore these interconnections with democracies and with, well, let me just say, and with education, which I haven't actually done. But you could see that all of the moves that I was making have direct connections, not only to understanding functioning in successful democracies, but also understanding education itself. So imagine an educational system that doesn't support these virtues, but instead, by implication, supports their opposites. So an educational system that does not teach students to distinguish what they know from what they do not know is not cultivating education properly so-called. Any educational system properly so-called will embody the cultivation of all of these intellectual virtues. And it will help us with complex questions and concepts. Concepts such as, what is democracy itself? So now let us turn to some of the other tools of critical thinking, but I'm going to now enter these tools. I'm going to enter a different part of our theory. Now I'm on the community online now, and I'm going to show you where I am. So for those of you who remember, you can go back and view some of these and read through some of these pages. So if you're at the main blue menu, we're going to the Library of Publications for Everyone. And we're going to focus on, right now, the top miniature guide. I realize we only have half of our guides pages in each one of the guides, but still we have quite a considerable amount of material for you here. So I'm going over to, let us look at this overview page just briefly. I focused just a few minutes on intellectual traits. Now I'm going to enter the elements of reasoning a bit with a different set of questions, and then we'll focus on the standards for reasoning and the barriers to reasoning very briefly. So now I'm focusing in on all of the primary conceptual sets in that original circle, but a few minutes ago, I was focused on the virtues from the point of view of how overall, if you understand them and embody them, then you can see their importance to successful democracies. Now what I want to do is say, if we have further tools of thinking, then we can use these tools to unpack questions like, what is democracy itself? And how do we pursue questions like, how do we find out whether there are any functioning democracies in the world today? What are the democracies, so-called democracies that exist? And what are they doing? What do they entail? What can we learn from that kind of research? And to do that, we simply need to understand that whenever we reason, these parts are present. We always have a purpose. We're asking questions. We use information. We make inferences based on the information and the assumptions we're beginning with, and the concepts that inform our assumptions, all of which are interconnected with our point of view, and all of which leads to implications and consequences. And/or consequences. So what I want to do here is to focus in on the question, what is democracy? And to do that, we see that we're entering these elements of reasoning at the concept of concepts. So we're saying, what is democracy? What is critical thinking itself? What are the interrelationships between these? That's fundamentally a conceptual question, although we need information to get into examples of successful democracies. But we know that we're fundamentally facing a conceptual question, and we know that we need a rich conception of democracy to go much further. We've talked a bit about the concept of critical thinking. We're using some of the tools right now, and that's driving us to this question, what is a functioning democracy? And so notice, again, this is fundamentally a conceptual question. And this question then has led me to a little bit of research I want to just walk you through. And before I do that, I want for you to notice that I'm going to be focusing mainly from these elements on the concept of democracy and some information that will help us understand the status of democracies in human societies today. So I'm entering at these two primary points. Now, let us go over to a document that I downloaded. When I asked the question, what is a successful democracy? And embedded in that is, what is democracy itself again? And I looked at a couple of pages online and I found this report from Freedom House. And I wanted to show you how I sized it up as a beginning place, where I was asking myself, well, how is this going to help me? Let's see, what has it got that it offers? And what is it? How do I know it's even reputable? Well, it says Freedom House. It doesn't tell me a lot. There's a table of contents here. There's some information here that might tell me whether this is a legitimate. It looks like it's sponsored by a number of major groups. And if we go to the very back, we can see that it's a nonprofit organization, which I won't turn to right now. So we do a little bit of overview to see, does this look legitimate? We're still not sure if it is, but we'll read a little further and see if it's helpful. And what we see right away are some key findings. Global freedom declined for the 18th consecutive year in 2023. Political rights and civil liberties were diminished in 52 countries, while only 21 countries made improvements. Now, we might be asking, well, how are they defining global freedom? That's an important question. Again, a conceptual question. And if we read further, hopefully this will be revealed. Flawed elections and armed conflict contributed to the decline, endangering freedom and causing severe human suffering. So we see right away some of the ways in which they're defining global freedom by looking at the opposites. They're saying flawed elections won't lead to global freedom. Armed conflict contributes to this problem. And human suffering is something we at this organization must be concerned about, because we're bringing that concept in as well. So we see some of the problems they're focusing on. Let's come back to that and look at, because we still need the concept of democracy. We're still looking for an expanded concept. So here I found a concept from an organization, an international organization, and let us look at their concept. Democracy means a legal form of rule which makes possible self-determination for all citizens in the sense of popular sovereignty by securing their significant participation in filling political decision-making positions and or in the decision itself in free, competitive, and fair processes, for example, elections, and securing opportunities for continuously influencing the political process, and by, in general, guaranteeing political rule is subject to oversight. Democratic participation in political rule thus it gets expressed in the dimensions of political freedom, political equality, and political and legal control. And notice they're referencing someone here. So now, as we are exploring this set of questions, we're asking, what is a rich democracy? What is a rich concept of that? So this gives us, I think, a good starting place. We can go further. We can do more exploration. If we're writing a paper or doing a research project on this, we're going to get more core definitions, and we're going to see how those interrelate, but this gives us a good starting place. And then we can see how some of these groups are defining the concept of democracy in more definitive terms. So notice this group has what they're calling a democracy matrix. And they're looking at how the decisions are made. Are the elections free, for example? To what degree is there equality? Is there equal opportunity to participate? Equal voting opportunities? Is there oversight by an electoral commission? Do the people have the freedom to organize? Do the people have the freedom to communicate? Is there independence of the judiciary and legal areas? And notice, I'm not going to read all of this to you because you can read it for yourself if you wish later. The point is that you can see that some people have spent a lot of time developing the concept and exploring the degree to which humans are upholding these freedoms in human societies. And I want to just point out a few other facts now. We've been dealing with the concept. Remember the elements of reasoning? We had the 8 elements. We didn't focus on the other 8, but we honed in on concept. Concepts we focused a little bit on here. Now let's turn a bit to information that helps us understand the state of democracies today. So here we can see a rough idea of how the number of countries that have improved through the years, starting with 2005, you can see this, 2005 going up to 2023. So in 2005, this many countries had improved and this many had declined based on these aggregate scores, which are similar to the ones that I showed you earlier. And notice today, it's as mentioned, numbers of countries that have improved, 21 versus 51 have declined on these freedom and democracy scores. And I want you to notice, interestingly, the zigzag nature of the progress. It's not a sloping forward. It's not a gradually improving diagram, is it? Or set of processes. It's zigzagging, and human progress tends to do that. We'll think we're always improving, but this gives us a sober understanding that it's much more complicated than that. And just to point out a little bit of information here to understand what some of these groups are doing to help us understand the state of democracies today. They're showing, for example, in this diagram, how in many countries elections are distorted by, for example, preventing the winner from taking office, or threatening or interfering with elections in other countries, using state resources in the media to aid incumbents, change the rules governing elections to disadvantage opponents or bypass term limits, control which candidates or parties will appear on the ballot. So this again gives us a richer sense of the problems that we face in achieving democracies. And just a little bit more to, again, I think, help understand some of the data that is available to us that we're often missing. So according to the way in which this group determines whether a country is free or not free or partly free, they argue that only 20% of the countries are free, 40% part free, and 30% not free. And notice that freedom improved for 7% of the world's population, but declined for 22% of the world's population. So again, just showing you how the information is out there. This helps us see how far we are away from achieving these realities that we want to achieve, and what democracies should entail. And again, notice the exploratory nature of this. We're only beginning to get started in using the tools of critical thinking to unpack these questions. And now I want to turn to one other part of critical thinking. And again, going back to intellect, to our core concepts, let us go back to the elements of reasoning. We focus just a few minutes on the concept of democracy, a few minutes on the concept of critical thinking, and a few minutes on some of the information available to us. And we would need a lot more time to explore the information and develop our conception. And now we can focus in on, of course, any of the elements, but I'm going to focus a little more on the core question at the heart of our focus today. And one of the things that critical thinking tools help us understand is that let me go back to our community online, and I want to show you a page that you can go back to. Again, this is the Library of Publications for Everyone. And I'm going to you have to scroll down a bit. The Art of Asking Essential Questions. And I'm going to page 17. We'll have to scroll through a few pages. And I'm focusing on this particular point, which is whenever you are faced with a complex question, there will be multiple domains within that question. And therefore, one of our questions could be, what are the domains within this question? And what are the questions within those domains? And here are some examples of some of the primary domains within which we may need to reason when faced with a complex question. So we can ask, does it have a biological component, a sociological or social dimension, a cultural, a political? What are the primary dimensions within which we need to reason to appropriately address this question? Now, there's an example here, which we're not going to look at now, but I want you to see that it's here. And you can use this for unpacking other questions again, just as an example or a kind of template, but there may be other domains in any given question you're focusing on. So we have a complex question here. What can be done about the number of people who abuse illegal drugs? We'll see that there are multiple domains within that question and questions within those domains. Now let's turn back to our question that we are focusing on, which is how and why is critical thinking essential to flourishing democracies? So if I'm entering at questions as a set of tools for helping me unpack that question, I can see that right away that there are multiple domains in this. One is the conceptual domain. And what I want you to notice here is I just am beginning to unpack the domains and the questions within the domains inherent in this complex question. So there'll be many that I'm missing. I'm just beginning to open this up. So notice, interestingly, I started with the conceptual, and that's because we need to know what critical thinking is, and we need to know what democracy is, and those are conceptual moves, and those are early first moves. But there are other conceptual questions here. What is a functioning democracy? What is a liberal or progressive democracy? What is critical thinking? What is the relationship between critical thinking and education? What is the relationship between successful democracies and critical thinking? What would or do the best democratic societies entail? What would or do they require? Are there any exemplary democratic societies which are models for the rest of the world? And then we have the social domain, and there will be more. There will be more conceptual questions. This is a beginning place. What social forces broadly and or historically affect democratic process? What social forces are affecting our democracy right now? What social needs and desires should democracies address? What responsibilities do democracies have to the common good and the public interest? What responsibilities do countries have to helping advance democracies in other countries? And then we have economic questions, political questions, legal questions, and we have educational questions, religious questions, and there will be more. And so what this helps us see is that we are facing a tremendous set of questions in the question, how do we make successful democracies? How do we maintain them? What do they entail? And we will be posting this in online, so you'll be able to read this later, and you may be able to add to these questions. And before I open this up for a few questions from you, let me make a couple of other primary points about the theory of critical thinking and how it helps us. And for this, I'm going to go back. We've talked a little bit about, just a very small amount, about intellectual traits. Remember, we started with that, intellectual virtues. We spent just a very small amount of time with the elements, in which I was showing you how by entering these, we can begin to unpack our question and to explore it on this set of questions together. Now, we know that if we understand intellectual standards, that what these do for us is they help us figure out how to assess reasoning itself. We can't have functioning democracies if we have people who don't know a clear statement from one that is not clear, an accurate one from one that is not accurate, a logical one from one that is illogical. We can't have functioning democracies if people need to be thinking in a deep way about a complex set of issues, and instead they're thinking in superficial ways, and they're pursuing superficial answers to complex questions. That is the norm in human societies. We can't have functioning democracies if people do not think broadly, or in other words, within other relevant viewpoints. You cannot take another viewpoint without a lot of angst and whining and complaining and suffering. Then how will we, if all of us do this, how will we collectively create anything like fully functioning democracies? again, if we're not focusing on the significant, if we're not focusing on the fair, and we can add other intellectual standards to this, we can see that we cannot uphold democracies. So this is, again, just some sense of the intellectual standards and the role that they play here. And then finally, in terms of the barriers to critical thinking, let me just say that we have in our thinking two things that are often functioning and that create tremendous problems for us. And those we can place under the categories of egocentric and sociocentric thinking. So roughly this means when we're being egocentric, this means that we're being either selfish or narrow-minded. When we're being sociocentric, we're either being groupish or selfish within our group. In other words, focusing on what is best for the group without regard to the rights and needs of others. Or we're locked within our group viewpoints. And it should be obvious that if we are functioning largely as self-serving, group-serving, narrow-minded humans, that we're not going to be able to achieve democracies that work well for the people, for all of the people. So that we need more exploration in, but that's a beginning place for thinking about the barriers to successful democracies. And then finally, let me just point out to you that if we want democracies that work for the people, we're also going to need to envision and pursue fair-minded critical societies. And you can see here what these societies entail as a beginning place. And you should have some sense of their interconnections. The interconnections between these points and both education and democracy, democracies that work. So let me stop there. As you see, there's a lot, and there's much, much more. And I'm, again, only beginning to explore how critical thinking helps us understand these questions. So hopefully you were able to follow some of these exploratory moves that I was making, so that you see that, yes, we did answer the question to some degree, but we also mainly opened up a whole set of questions that we can't possibly answer here, and that it would take tremendous concerted effort in working through these, and tremendous effort to actually bring critical thinking to the people. And you can ask yourself, how likely is that in your given country? And we'll leave it there.